In an episode, you mentioned that weighted jumps do not make a lot of sense in your point of view, as a power output seems to be the highest in performing unweighted jumps. Do you still think there's value in including weighted jumps into the training of a field sports athlete trying to increase power output? How would you progress them from heavier jumps with longer contact times to lighter jumps with shorter contact times? So this kind of touches on something that's kind of pretty prevalent in the literature, and it's not a clear answer as of yet what it makes the most sense in terms of using weighted jumps or weighted plyometrics. So if we look at what the literature says, or some of the sports science hypotheses say, or the theories, the prevailing theories, which have been well proven. So any long-term listeners of the podcast or the YouTube will have heard me talk about the dynamic power output hypothesis, which essentially states that the lower limbs at explosive movements, running, jumping, produce the most power at the participant's own body weight, so non-unweighted movements, so not weighted vest running, not weighted jumps. So that's been well repeated, and it's something we talked about a little bit in this week's paper review or previous week's paper review, where we mentioned that repeatability of results is very important. So not just one finding, but multiple different people in different scenarios reproducing results that line up and give us a strong hypothesis, or give us a strong plethora of evidence for something that we can say that with confidence. So one particular study recently, so in the last few years, did quite an interesting scenario where they compared unweighted jumps, barbell back squat jumps, and then trap bar or hex bar jumps, deadlift jumps essentially. So again, in their study, they reproduced the typical findings that the unweighted jumps produce the most amount of peak power, the barbell back jumps produce the least amount of power, and then the weighted hex bar jumps at approximately 20% of the participants' 1RM produce similar levels of peak power compared to the other weighted jumps. So what they mentioned was, while it's not clear that that using what's the best form of producing most power in athletes, is it using weighted jumps or not, they did speculate, in line with other researchers' studies, was that progressive overload using some weighted jumps might be a very, very good scenario for slow velocity movements, or reproducing your ability to deal with slow velocity skills. Right now, I think there's no good evidence in favor of using weighted jumps for most people. So it might be in a personal experience for a coach that they might use weighted jumps. Right now, for the vast majority of people watching this, are not in a position to use weighted jumps effectively. So if we had elite level athletes who'd mastered the plyometrics, who had mastered unweighted jumps, who had a very, very strong level of back squat or overall strength and a lot of resistance training. If you look at, for example, the progressions Yuri puts in his kind of shock method book, he goes through different things, and like the second or third stage is 1RM or high force training, strength training. So a lot of people can't justifiably, in our opinion, use weighted jumps as of yet. So if the evidence is not clear, do weighted jumps work better than unweighted jumps? However, there's certainly a lot of risks associated with weighted jumps. It doesn't make sense for most people to jump right into weighted jumps until they've really mastered the other ones. And then in that scenario, you need to weigh up, do weighted jumps make sense for this particular athlete? Then you have a retest scenario, because again, the literature isn't highly in favor of it. It might actually make you slower. It might make you more specific to slower based or slower velocity movements. So again, it's very dependent on the athlete, but in most scenarios, you would kind of lean away from using weighted jumps.
Yeah, I think in the case of a field athlete, it harkens back to the weighted sled or resisted sprinting kind of arguments that we hear people having all the time. So to refresh your mind on this, right, the resisted sprinting is that like you'd sprint against the resistance, and then because you've sprinted against the resistance, you're going to be a faster sprinter, right? When you look at the literature, it can make you a faster sprinter in the way that it will improve a certain phase of your sprinting. So like the acceleration phase, forcing people to stay more leant over into a sprinting position, allowing athletes who might kind of come upright immediately once they leave the blocks, giving them like the kinesthetic cueing they might need to associate with this is what good running form is, right? But the physiological adaptation you're seeking with something like a sled pull, in the same way the physiological adaptation you're seeking with a weighted jump isn't there. Like it's not, the adaptation isn't as effective as the adaptation would be if you were jumping without resistance, and it's actually not as good as the adaptation would be if you were jumping with facilitation. So if you're an athlete whose vertical jump is really important to them, right? So an example of this would be a basketballer. Another example would be any athlete going to a combine situation where there's a series of tests. The tests are quantitative tests where they're looking at a 1RM value at the end of it. So a vertical jump, a broad jump, something like that. If you want the athlete to get really fucking good at jumping high, you don't make them jump with weights on. Ideally, you'd have them in a facilitative loading setting where they're through a harness or through some sort of like bands or pulleys. That athlete is being facilitated to jump higher. So they're in an accommodative resistance, except that resistance is coming off them. It's like an assisted pull-up machine. So if I want to get somebody to jump high, I'll teach them how to jump high and jump fast and stay in the air for longer. You don't constantly keep loading them. And look, it's oxymoronic, because if you're coming from a strength training background, you think more load is more force is more adaptation, but that's not how it works for speed adaptation, and it's not how it works for like stretch shortening cycle adaptations. So in general, there are one or two applications. The same way with sprinting with sleds and sprinting against resistance, there are a few applications whereby it can work. But in general, if you want to get somebody to jump higher, then you should be allowing them to jump higher and forcing them to jump higher. And if anything, like drawing on them to jump higher, you shouldn't be pulling them back down.
So in some scenarios, right, there it might make sense to make the use of weighted jumps, right? So when you have weighted jumps and plyometrics or jumps, you increase what's known as ground reaction forces. If you measured the jump they were doing on a weighted plate, you would see that the forces imparted into the ground are higher than if you were not weighted. So essentially, you have to impart more force downward into the ground to elevate your mass off the ground, to escape the pull of gravity, essentially. So while this happens slower, it's a higher force movement. So this might be useful for people. So in terms of like field athletes, it looks like it's probably not useful. But in terms of someone like a weightlifter, it might be very, very useful to have a better ability to impart higher ground reactive forces, or someone with heavy deadlifts, in terms of how fast that needs to happen. So if you can make that happen fast, but with a little bit more ground reaction forces, if you learn that skill, for example, in the split jerk, the Soviets would have shown that lifters' ability to jump higher with 50% of their body weight with the barbell on their back correlated with a better ability to split jerk heavier weights. However, their vertical jump did not correlate with their ability to split jerk weights. So their weighted jump with 50%. So it's a very specific scenario where weighted jumps might be useful. Again, we're incredibly open to, if someone provides a compelling argument in some longitudinal studies or a series of athletes who use weighted jumps and their sprint time got better, or their ability to produce force got a lot better, then we're more than happy to be open to that scenario. But right now, it doesn't look like that is the optimal scenario for increasing power, or for example, vertical height jump.
I think the last thing on like the power production thing, the power equation is like the rate at which work is done, right? So it's work over the change in time. So when people look at like the studies Gerf is talking about, they like which produce more power, right? That doesn't take sport specificity into account. So it's not always about like what has the highest power output. There are specific situations like the one Owen was talking about there, where like you have a weightlifter where the specificity of the ground reaction force and the specificity of how heavy a load is very, very important to that sport. So when you're looking at papers, it's not always about like highest power output. Like your power output on a kipping pull-up is higher than your power output on a normal pull-up or a strict pull-up, because you get more work done in less time, but it doesn't mean it's a better training tool than anything else.
Finally, the last problem with weighted jumps, and it's probably the most important one in terms of weighted jumps, right, is that they're almost certainly one of the most potentially dangerous exercises you could do when you're working with athletes. So if you look at the negatives and potential positives of those, it probably doesn't make sense to do them. So you're putting a lot of pressure on your joints. For example, if you're doing weighted back squat jumps, you're putting a lot of pressure on your lower vertebrae when you land, putting a lot of pressure to your ligaments and joints and tendons. Now, in some scenarios, it might force a positive adaptation, but very easily you could also end up in the opposite scenario where you're ending up with a negative adaptation or potentially leading to injury through incorrect technique, inability to withstand those forces, not a high level of strength essentially, or not enough years of training. So I would say before you get to weighted jumps, do you have the requisite? Have you maxed out your ability, maxed out your possible training with plyometrics on all other forms? And I would say the answer is probably not.